It's entitled
Good evening. Earlier this year, the Late Show revived the venerable television tradition of the improvised history lecture. Then Professor Alan Bullock stood before the camera, speaking without a script, as A.J.B. Taylor had done in his many television broadcasts. Tonight, another scholar takes up the historical challenge. Edward Thompson is one of the most distinguished historians of his generation. His books have changed the way we think about the past. They've also sold in numbers that many novelists would envy. His latest work, Customs in Common, takes him back to the territory he's made his own, the 18th century. In a moment, Professor Thompson will be talking unscripted about the importance of tradition in that century and how, far from being a conservative force, it could and did become a focus for resistance and change. But first, a brief history of the history man.
The Lord begins to honor us. The saints are marching on. The sword is sharp, the arrows swift, to destroy Babylon. Against the kingdom of the beast, we witnesses do rise.
Thompson might best be seen as a kind of latter-day A.J.P. Taylor, a kind of gadfly amongst the historical profession, somebody who's never really quite been regarded as a professional historian, but whose impact is all the greater because of that, because he is an agitator, an outsider, because he is impassioned, because he incorporates literature and history, because he's interested in politics in the present day as well as historical. He is somehow larger than life as a historian.
Edward Thompson's history has always been inexorably tied to his politics. He first came to academic prominence as one of a group of Marxist historians that included Christopher Hill, George Roudet and Eric Hobsbawm. Their aim was to dig beneath the conventional history of international diplomacy and parliamentary politics to uncover a quite different experience of the past, that of ordinary working men and women.
Thompson's got this phrase about rescuing people from the enormous condescension of the present, indeed of historians. And I think that the greatest thing maybe that Thompson has done is to take up the cause of the forgotten people of history, the stockingers, the handloom weavers, the women who went on riots in the 16th century, the early Methodists, and far from sentimentalizing them or preserving them in aspic, to show that these were tremendously important forces in history.
There's no doubt whatever, I think, that Thompson's is a very remarkable achievement. It focused attention into areas where the historian had not gone before. It looked at groups that people thought were simply unknowable. It made evidence tellers new things. It gave voice to the voiceless. It made the inarticulate speak. And this is remarkable, and this is valuable. But of course it made them speak with an alarming unanimity of voice. It actually, in a sense, dare I say it, reflected a very de haut en bas view of the poor in its own right. The poor were required to behave in a certain sort of way that corresponded to a particular political dogma.
The dogma that some historians see in his work is that for Thompson, the history of the poor was always the history of their radical political struggle. In his alternative historical narrative, British democracy, far from being a gift bestowed by the ruling classes, was a right which working people fought for, from the Levellers to Peterloo to the Chartists. But as a political historian, Thompson also had to contend with the politics of his own time.
In 1956, the uprising in Hungary and its suppression by the Soviet forces placed the British Communist Party perhaps in the worst dilemma of its history. One of those who broke with the party at that time was E.P. Thompson.
You have to consider the whole history and structure of this party, the system of democratic centralism, which has made impossible the kind of free initiative and democratic activity of the members, whether they're members working in ordinary political fields or in intellectual fields.
Through the late 50s and 60s, Thompson emerged as one of the key intellectual figures of the New Left. Out of this rethinking of traditional Marxist ideas came his greatest achievement. In 1963, he published his masterpiece, The Making of the English Working Class.
The great strength, I think, of Thompson was to, as it were, to rub out that predestined march of the working man and to ask the question, well, what were things like before industrialization? And what he shows wonderfully in The Making of the Working Class is that there was an industrial economy before the Industrial Revolution and independently of it. It was home industry, it was cottage industry, it was a sector of manufacturing that took place in the villages and part and parcel of rural life. And so the great strength of The Making of the English Working Class of the book was actually to show that labouring people had their important conflictual history with employers, with expropriators, long before you had that kind of powerful factory movement with organised working class trade unions that most labour historians had always written about. So he, as it were, extended by 100 years, by 300 years, the scope of a history of the people.
It's difficult to characterise the impact of The Making of the English Working Class in academic terms alone, because it was part of a very glamorous, very exciting period in which all sorts of norms seemed to be overturned, and a genuinely new generation seemed to be facing a genuinely new age, doing things different. And Edward Thompson gave dignity to labour in the decade, the 1960s, when it seemed to have achieved most of its previous ideals.
From The Making of the English Working Class, Thompson went deeper into the 18th century. With books like Whigs and Hunters, he overturned the conventional image of that period as one of largely uneventful stability.
Until Edward Thompson's time, there was a tendency to see the 18th century as a battleground for aristocrats, with a happy rising middle class getting the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution ready. And as for the working people, they turn up in Hogarth drawings in places like Gin Lane, and they didn't seem to have a great deal to say for themselves. After Edward Thompson had written, it became obvious that all that was untrue. There was a third class to be reckoned with in 18th century history, and it was terribly important.
What is astonishing about a work like Whigs and Hunters is that it uses what most of us would regard as a rather peculiarly small subject, a particular act of Parliament and a particular question, hunting and poaching, and it takes this apparently very narrow topic and suddenly it's really rather like burying into Tutankhamun's tomb. You have this tiny little point of entry. You drive down the shaft, you accumulate this great weight of information, and then you stand up inside, and you've got this great open chamber heaped with the riches of a whole society, which you're able to see and to view. Now, that is a very remarkable achievement.
In the 1980s, Thompson moved his attention from writing history into trying to influence it. His involvement in the politics of the peace movement made him a controversial public figure. So controversial that in 1981, the BBC withdrew its invitation for him to give the Dimbleby Lecture. For 15 years, Thompson wrote no history. But as the politics of the Cold War retreat into the past, Thompson has returned to his role as historian with the publication of his book, Customs in Common, a study of popular culture in the 18th century.
Good evening. I shall be talking this evening about my work as a social historian, and in particular in the field of 18th century popular culture. One object of the inquiry will be to find out whether it gives us any purchase upon understanding popular culture today. Popular culture is a unsatisfactory and sometimes a sloppy term. It can stand for quite different things. On the one hand, it can stand for autonomous, independent, and inventive culture arising from the common people themselves, as it sometimes does in the 18th century. On the other hand, it can stand for commercial culture provided from above with the people as consumers, as it often does in the 20th century. In history, the first is continually being swamped by or passing into the second. However, we can't get away from using this term, which is one of those very large general terms like society, politics, and economy, which we can't do without. It's a clumpish sort of term made up of many different attributes, and we can't get very far in our analysis unless we break this clump up into its parts. For example, into traditions, value systems, rites, rituals, artifacts, signs and symbolic vocabulary,
take it in its parts and examine each of them separately. For example, can we look at the ritual performance known as a wife sale? This ritual prescribed that the wife should be led by a halter of straw or rope into an acknowledged marketplace by her husband, and there put up to what, at least in seeming, was an open auction. When the auction was decided, then the end of the rope was transferred by the husband to the purchaser, and the parties would sometimes adjourn to the nearby inn to ratify the deal by signing papers and for a round of drinks. This wife sale was endorsed by the watching crowd, who accepted it as a true form of transfer. At first sight, it looks like a pretty barbaric, absolutely and utterly male-dominated chattel purchase, rather like a slave sale. But as one goes more carefully through the evidence, a different sort of game with different rules begins to disclose itself. For one thing, it turns out that the consent of the wife is always assumed and is indeed essential to a proper transfer. In fact, on occasion, one finds that she is clearly being sold to a man who was already her lover, and sometimes she was actually gone away and was living with this other man. So in this kind of context, the sale appears to be a form of popular divorce, although it's still male-dominated in the sense that there's scarcely any husband sales recorded. I found 2 or 3, but I think they're rather dubious. And it is really a transfer of a wife, not of any party to the marriage. So I'm not in that sense apologizing for it as egalitarian, but there are circumstances in which the wife could turn this ritual to her own advantage. Now, what has this got to do with culture? Quite a lot, because this form of ritual only achieves its meaning insofar as it is endorsed by the popular culture of the rougher end of the plebeians in the 18th century and the early 19th century. That is, if they didn't accept this as a legitimate form of transfer, then it would just have been a form of pantomime. As an informant in Devon told a reverend folklore collector, "Law bless your honor, you can ask anyone if that ain't marriage, good, true, and Christian, and they'll tell you it is." So the informant purported to know better than the clergyman who was asking him what a Christian marriage was, and the wife sale was accepted as such. So in that sense, it is culturally constructed, and it is attributed its meaning by the crowd who endorse those particular forms. More elaborate forms are found in what is known as rough music, which is the French form of charivari, forms of shaming ritual which ostracize, stigmatize, sometimes outlaw persons in the community who have offended against community norms. They take different forms in different parts of the country. There's the more elaborate form known as the skimmington in the West Country, riding the stang in the north of England, plain effigy burning in many parts, the Welsh ceffyl pren or wooden horse, local forms like the Wiltshire wusset hunting or the Devon stag hunt. In the skimmington, the couple who are representing the victims are seated on an old horse or a donkey. The man is facing the backside, the woman facing the front, and she is beating over her shoulder with a long kitchen instrument, the man, and sometimes that is a skimming ladle, which I think is probably not the origin of the term, but sometimes has been suggested as such. Now, this was usually performed in defense of male patriarchal notations of the marriage relationship, and was performed in cases where the wife was wearing the breeches or was interfering in her husband's business affairs or had been striking him unrepute, and it was also aimed at the husband who had been so weak as to allow this state of affairs to take place. In a 17th century verse, Skimmington is but a riding, used of course where the grey mare's the better horse, when o'er the breaches greedy women fight to enlarge their vast dominion. So it is in defense of patriarchal values that in the West you have these forms, especially. But they're used in that part and in other parts for many, many different occasions. Any sort of ludicrous marriage, ill-suited marriage, one in which a very young person marries an elderly person, it's thought for money, where they're a rather robust, a rather colourful pre-sexual, premarital sexual reputation. That sometimes occasions it, sometimes a second wedding occasions it. And then you have other sorts of offence. Adultery occasions rough music. Men who harass young women. In some parts, homosexuality is an occasion for rough music. Child abusers are rough music. Sometimes officials who are very unpopular, like magistrates, police, gamekeepers, excisemen, you can name them yourself, persons who in a local or village or community sense are particular targets for dislike. Now, this can be very severe or it can be more light-hearted. It can on occasion drive people out of the community altogether. So rough music also has its meanings attributed to it, not just by the forms are important, but by the culture which selects the victims and ascribes the meanings to them. You have occasions where, as in Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, a rough music can actually result in someone being so shamed by this that they commit suicide. Well, if we go back to this clumpish term, popular culture, the things that interest me particularly now inside it are custom, need, and expectations. None of them are quite as easy to define as they might at first appear. I'm just publishing a book called Customs in Common. Now, this is not about custom in all times and in all places, or in England in all times. The 18th century had a very particular kind of robust and, I think, independent plebeian culture. This was partly because of the weak power over the people's minds of the established church in the 18th century. Many reasons for that. Also the weak power of the monarchy. The British people were not particularly deferent towards a Hanoverian monarchy that had been brought over in order to keep the system together. At the same time, this is a period which some historians call proto-industrialization, when there is an immense increase in the number of cottage workers and out workers, textile workers, metal workers, also, of course, of colliers, tin miners, and so on. And these people are increasingly independent of the sort of controls which in old village life had been exerted upon them, increasingly independent in that way, and inventive, innovative in their cultural forms. So this is a rather special case. Custom in this special case is increasingly used to justify rights of the people in the name of tradition, in the name of prior example, although often these prior examples are stretched very hard to the advantage of the people in any way they can. A number of examples could be taken of this. One of them is the example of food riots, which are quite common in the 18th century. Food riots when prices become quite exceptionally high. riot is not perhaps the best word for describing these actions, which are often very orderly and self-disciplined, and the object of which is to set the price, that is, to impose upon the market dealers or the farmers what is regarded as a fair price by the market crowd, and they gather in the marketplace and force the reduction of prices to their fair price. This fair price being based in part upon normal prices in normal times, in part upon their sense of what their urgent needs are and what the resources of the country are. So they set the price in that kind of way, not according to market forces. And that brings us back to this four-letter word, need, which seems to be self-explanatory. We think we all know what needs are, or we used to think so. I think we have a more complex view now. In the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, classical political economy didn't find need a very problematic concept. After all, people had evident material needs, and they needed money to buy those material goods, and you could make charts of supply and demand which showed you with fair accuracy the movement of need. And the main antagonist in the 19th century political economy, classical Marxism, in fact shared some of the same tenets. The hero of political economy was acquisitive economic man. The hero of Marxism was exploited and rebellious economic man, but both of them constructed their notion of economic man in somewhat similar ways. Well, we know that need can be a great deal more complex than that. In fact, this was quite evident in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, not only in this country, but in nearly all countries undergoing industrialization. You have a similar experience in which people have to learn the necessary needs to become useful consumers for the new products which industrialization itself is creating. This is a sort of circle which has to be made. Needs are themselves constructed. They are not necessarily innate. Of course, everyone has hunger. They need a certain amount of food and shelter. I will take that for granted. But beyond that point, they are constructed within the culture. For example, you have a struggle in the early stages of industrialization between the monetary incentives and time preference. People may, the artisans and skilled workers, may opt for leisure at a certain point rather than maximizing the monetary, the income reward. And this is not just a question of the weekly monetary reward, in which they may knock off altogether on Tuesday or on Monday. Monday is known as Saint Monday, and many artisans take Monday off as a matter of course and don't start work until late on Tuesday, when it's said the handloom weaver is going to a slow, leisurely rhythm of plenty of time, plenty of time. And by Friday night or Saturday, he's working by candlelight, and the loom is rushing backwards and forwards, a day too late, a day too late, a day too late, a day too late. That sort of rhythm of the week is part of a rhythm of the year which gives a space every now and then for a blowout, for a wakes, for a communal holiday with feasting, courtship, bouts of drinking and so on, and then long periods of hardship, hard work, short commons interspersed in between. And life is perhaps helpful to see it in the term picaresque. That is, it's a sort of random journey down a road without much planning, with accidents, haphazard accidents and episodes along the way, without planning for careers. No one has mortgages. No one can provide against epidemics or severe food shortages or trade dislocations. These are things that happen. So that people live in this rather haphazard sort of picaresque way. And this
also is supported by a limited horizon of change. That is, the social horizons of one generation follow on being very similar to those of the preceding generation. There is no expectation that a young couple will necessarily be yuppies or will be upwardly mobile. Indeed, that's regarded as an offense against their neighbors sometimes. There is a sort of social steady state which people have achieved. A young couple may not get married until there's a cottage vacant in the community, and when they enter it, they expect more or less to inherit the customary way of life and expectations, standards of their predecessors. I use the word expectation, and after custom and need, I think expectation is an extremely important word. Because the Industrial Revolution very certainly did break through the threshold of expectations of the precedent customary society, it was necessary actively to construct, to create, to implant new needs in the working population itself so that they could become a market, could become consumers for the goods which they themselves produced. And as the Industrial Revolution went on, and as matters proceeded into this century, so the amount of resources diverted into the creation of need, into the raising of expectations, became larger and larger. It hasn't stopped yet. And of course it became worldwide. So that it is indeed the explosion in expectations which is the most significant thing about our time, even more significant than population explosion or technological breakthrough. This explosion in expectations, which has penetrated even the thick thorn hedges around some African and Indian villages, bringing new needs to their notice through the film and radio and so on, bringing them to 1 billion Chinese, is the significant fact of our time. When these new needs and satisfactions, these expectations, only exist in the advanced world in the West and are partially met there, we're very smug about it. We don't think it matters very much. But when we find it's extending into the third world, into China, then we get anxious because the global resources seem to be threatened, as indeed they are. So that the question then of our time is, can we discover new needs which will lead us to a new kind of stable state? Can we unlearn some of the needs created by the Industrial Revolution in the advanced world? Is it possible that 18th century popular culture might still have something to teach us? Well, now, I think it might. But I have to give a warning, first of all. And this warning is that in the past decades, there has increasingly, in all parts of the world, for different reasons, been anti-democratic note coming in, especially among intellectuals, a fear of popular culture, a fear of the people, or at least a distaste of it. And this has sometimes been for good reasons. After all, we've seen totalitarian regimes which seem to rest upon the passivity of the people. We've also seen in Western democracies, in other democracies, populist politicians who've been able rather easily to mislead the people and to betray them. And there have been other forces. There have been occasions when really ferocious nationalisms, when anti-Semitism, when prejudices of various kinds have seemed to be rooted in popular culture itself. And in those circumstances, a section of the intelligentsia throughout the world has tended to put itself in islands to cease to act in common ways and in common discourse with their fellow citizens, has tended to put themselves in fortresses with rather specialist languages which somehow privilege the intelligentsia themselves as the only free agents who are not subject to determinations of discourse, determinations of thought in which the common people are trapped. Now, I think it's very serious that this form of fear and distaste of the common people has become so entrenched, because it's liable to bring about exactly what it purports to fear. And it's also a cop-out in a way as well, because quite a lot of this formative process has come not from popular sources themselves, but from commercial, political indoctrination from above upon the people. For example, it's not the common people today in the West who are making such a farce of political life, where it's becoming not anymore a question of rational debate and rational argument about serious issues, but simply the flotation projection of alternative images. It is making of politics what I once called tautocracy, that is the beaming of prejudices and political images upon the people one day, followed the next day by pollsters going around their doors, knocking on the doors and asking them what they think, and of course they get the echo of the beam back again, a complete sort of tautology or political process. And I think that that way is a very serious way of destroying democratic initiative altogether. Well, now, I think it is not the case that popular culture is always a good thing, but I certainly don't think it's the case that it hasn't been a good thing sometimes, and we have to try and understand the moments when it has been good and try and encourage that kind of situation and forces. Perhaps in the last couple of years, we've been living through times in which we've seen a vital, a vibrant, innovative, independent popular culture once again. I'm referring, of course, to the events since 1989 in Eastern Europe and more recently in the Soviet Union, when it does seem that one has had a real initiative which is liberating to our thoughts as well. And I remember a time when intellectuals very often would tell one with Orwellian pessimism that a totalitarian regime could never be shifted, that its forces were absolutely controlling. Well, we have seen today totalitarian regimes shifted quite dramatically. I was across in 1980 in Prague trying to make contact with members of Charter 77. It was then a very small body, a few score courageous intellectuals who were trying still to issue statements addressed to the Czech and Slovak peoples, but who were finding it very difficult to gain support. Well, now, in 1989, you suddenly saw the greater part of those nations turning over and giving their support behind Václav Havel and Dubček. So that we have seen that sort of vitality in our time, and it might hearten us once again. I remain convinced that the period of the Industrial Revolution in England, Scotland, and Wales was a period of similar vitality, the period in which the institutions of the working class, the trade unions, the radical political movements were formed, the period of the Peterloo demonstration and of the Chartists, the period of chapel debates and free thought societies, the period of Owenite cooperators. This was an amazingly vital and inventive period, and it came when radical ideas, which actually came less from the common people, the working people, but from the radical middle class, above all the ideas of Tom Paine, his Rights of Man, were taken on board in this very robust and independent plebeian culture, taken on board by them and made part of their program and part of their project. My final point is that if we cease to believe in the possibility of a vital and creative, innovative popular culture, then we can scarcely believe in democracy at all. We have to see democracy instead, as some people do, as a system of safeguards, of defenses, of controls against the people, rather than a liberating space in which invention and innovation is encouraged among them. And if that happens, then really we are in a very bad way indeed. And we should act both as scholars and researchers and act as citizens to try and create the conditions in which there is, once again, a lively and creative popular culture as there has been in the past. Thank you very much.
Edward Thompson. On the Late Show next week, we go among the thugs, out on the football terraces with the editor of Granta. We investigate 5 things you thought you knew about Toulouse-Lautrec, and we take you to Tokyo Newtown, the world's most spectacular urban jungle, a city inspired by chaos or slowly collapsing into it. And for what you missed this week, don't forget Late Again on Saturday at 6:30. Good night.